The cookbook revenge. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was making coffee when her daughter-in-law walked into the kitchen, grabbed the old cookbook from the shelf, and dropped it straight into the garbage. No hesitation. No respect. "Time to modernize this kitchen," she announced. Margaret didn't react. She just stirred her coffee and smiled. Because she knew something her daughter-in-law didn't. That cookbook was worth more than the entire house they were standing in, but let's start from the beginning. Because this story is about family, betrayal, and a 200-year-old secret that would tear everything apart. Are you ready? Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the like button. Margaret Hayes was 73 years old when her son Daniel married Jessica. The wedding was beautiful. Expensive. Margaret had contributed significantly to make her son's dream day perfect. She smiled through every moment, even when Jessica made it clear that Margaret's traditional values were outdated. Daniel was Margaret's only child. After her husband Robert passed away 5 years earlier, Daniel had become her entire world. So when he announced his engagement to Jessica, a corporate lawyer from Boston, Margaret swallowed her reservations and welcomed the young woman into the family. The first year of marriage was tolerable. Jessica was polite but distant. She called Margaret Mrs. Hayes instead of a mom. She declined invitations to Sunday dinners, citing work commitments. Margaret understood. Young people had busy lives, but then Daniel suggested something that changed everything. "Mom," he said one evening, "Jessica and I have been thinking. Your house is too big for one person. And we're cramped in our apartment. What if we moved in with you? Just temporarily. Until we save enough for our own place." Margaret's 3-bedroom Victorian home had been in the Hayes family for 4 generations. Every room held memories. Robert's reading chair by the fireplace. The kitchen where she'd baked thousands of cookies for Daniel's childhood. The garden where Robert had proposed on a spring evening in 1970. But Daniel was looking at her with such hope. Such need. "Of course," Margaret heard herself say. "This is your home too, sweetheart." Jessica's smile that day should have been Margaret's first warning. It wasn't warm. It was victorious. They moved in on a Saturday in October. Within a week, Margaret barely recognized her own home. Jessica started with small changes. The living room curtains Margaret had sewn by hand were too heavy. Robert's collection of vintage maps was cluttering the walls. The antique china cabinet that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother was taking up valuable space. Each item disappeared into the basement or, as Margaret later discovered, sold online. "Jessica's just trying to make the space more modern," Daniel explained when Margaret tentatively mentioned the missing items. "You know how young people are about minimalism." Margaret bit her tongue. This was temporary, she reminded herself. They'd be gone in 6 months. Maybe a year, but Jessica had other plans. One evening, Margaret overheard a conversation from the living room. "When do you think she'll agree to move to assisted living?" Jessica's voice was casual, as if discussing the weather. "Jess, she's perfectly healthy," Daniel protested weakly. "For now. But she's 73, Daniel. How much longer can she manage these stairs? This big house? And honestly, with what this property is worth in the current market," Margaret's hand froze on the banister. She backed away quietly, heart pounding. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house wasn't just property. It was her history. Her family's legacy. And Jessica was already calculating its value like a real estate investment. The next morning, Margaret made a decision. She would watch. She would listen. And she would protect what was hers. Over the following months, Jessica's true nature revealed itself piece by piece. She began inviting her friends over without asking Margaret. They'd drink wine in the living room, laughing too loudly, leaving glasses on antique tables without coasters. When Margaret politely mentioned the water rings, Jessica rolled her eyes. "God, Daniel, does she have to micromanage everything? It's just furniture." "Just furniture." pieces that had been carefully maintained for decades. A coffee table Robert had restored with his own hands. Then came the kitchen incident. Margaret had always been an exceptional cook. Her recipes had been featured in the local newspaper. Neighbors requested her apple pie every Thanksgiving. Her Sunday roasts were legendary in their small Vermont town, but Jessica had other ideas about the kitchen. "This needs to be completely renovated," she announced one morning, gesturing around the room with her coffee mug. "These cabinets are ancient. The stove is from the Dark Ages. And all this?" She waved dismissively at Margaret's collection of cooking tools, spices, and yes, her cookbook. "All this clutter has to go." "Jessica, I use everything in this kitchen," Margaret said quietly. "You use it to make the same old recipes you've been making for 50 years. Nobody eats that heavy food anymore, Margaret. It's all about clean eating now. Organic. Minimal ingredients." The disrespect in Jessica's voice was unmistakable. But what hurt more was the silence from Daniel, who sat at the table scrolling through his phone, pretending not to hear. "My recipes," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt, "have fed this family for generations." Jessica laughed. Actually laughed. Generations of clogged arteries, maybe. That night, Margaret took her cookbook from the kitchen shelf and held it in her lap. The leather cover was worn soft from decades of use. Some pages were stained with butter and flour. Handwritten notes filled the margins in her mother's handwriting. Her grandmother's. Her great-grandmother's. 200 years of Hayes women had contributed to this book. Their secrets, their wisdom, their love, and Jessica thought it was garbage. 3 weeks later, on that Tuesday morning, everything came to a head. Margaret was making her morning coffee when Jessica swept into the kitchen. She was on her phone, talking loudly to someone about a client meeting. Without breaking conversation, she walked to the cookbook shelf, grabbed Margaret's precious book, and dropped it directly into the trash can. The sound of it hitting the bottom of the bin seemed impossibly loud. Margaret froze. Coffee scoop suspended in midair. Jessica ended her call and looked at Margaret with something like satisfaction. "Time to modernize this kitchen," she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Your recipes are outdated anyway. Just like, well," she smiled, "just like a lot of things around here." She walked out, heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Margaret stood there for a long moment. Then she carefully finished making her coffee, stirred it slowly, and smiled, because Jessica had just made the biggest mistake of her life. That cookbook wasn't just recipes. And Margaret's silence? It wasn't acceptance. It was strategy. After Jessica left for work and Daniel departed for his office, Margaret retrieved the cookbook from the trash. She wiped it clean and carried it to her bedroom. Then she sat on her bed and opened it to page 47. Between the recipe for her grandmother's apple pie and her mother's Sunday roast, exactly where they'd been for the last 30 years, were 3 envelopes. The first contained the deed to a lakeside property in northern Vermont. 20 acres of pristine waterfront land. Robert had purchased it in 1985 as an investment. The property was now worth approximately $1.2 million. The second envelope held stock certificates, IBM shares from the 1960s that had split multiple times. Their current value, $840,000. The third envelope was the most important. It was Robert's will, a copy Margaret had kept safe all these years. In it, Robert had left everything to Margaret with one clear instruction: the lakeside property and associated investments are to remain in the Hayes family name, passing to future generations who demonstrate respect for our family's history and values. Robert had been very specific. He'd seen how some families tore themselves apart over money. He'd wanted to ensure that their legacy went to someone who would treasure it, not just spend it. Margaret had hidden these documents in the cookbook because it was the one place she knew they'd be safe. Who would think to look there? The book was so ordinary, so domestic, so easy to overlook. Just like Margaret herself, Jessica had been planning to inherit everything. She'd been calculating the value of the house, planning renovations, Probably already browsing luxury vacation destinations she'd visit once the old woman was out of the way, but she'd just thrown away the very thing she was waiting for. And Margaret? Margaret was about to teach her a lesson about respect. Margaret didn't rush. Revenge served hot is satisfying. Revenge served cold is devastating. She spent the next week being the perfect grandmother. She baked cookies. She stayed quiet during Jessica's increasingly demanding commentary about the house. She smiled when Jessica brought over an interior designer to reimagine the space. Meanwhile, Margaret made some calls, first, to her lawyer, Theodore Walsh, who had handled the Hayes family affairs for 40 years. Theodore, I need to make some changes to my will. Of course, Margaret. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Margaret said slowly, that it's time to ensure my assets go to someone who will appreciate them. The second call was to her accountant. I need a complete assessment of all my holdings. Everything. And I need it done quietly. The third call was to Daniel's godmother, Patricia, who had known him since birth. Patricia, I need you to witness something for me. Can you come to dinner this Friday? Patricia, hearing the unusual steel in Margaret's voice, agreed immediately. Friday evening arrived. Margaret prepared a feast. Roasted chicken with herbs, garlic mashed potatoes, fresh green beans from her garden. And for dessert, her famous apple pie. She'd invited Patricia as planned. What she hadn't told Jessica and Daniel was that Theodore Walsh would be joining them as well. When Jessica came home and saw the formal dining table set for 5, she was annoyed. I told you I had plans tonight, Margaret. Cancel them, Margaret said pleasantly. This is important. Something in her tone made Jessica pause. She glanced at Daniel, who shrugged. They sat down to dinner. Patricia and Theodore made pleasant small talk. Margaret served each course with the same grace she'd shown for 50 years. Finally, over coffee and pie, Margaret set down her fork. I've asked you all here tonight because I have an announcement to make. Daniel looked up, concerned. Mom, are you okay? Is this about your health? My health is perfect, Margaret assured him. This is about my estate. Jessica's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her eyes sharpened with interest. Last week, Margaret continued, Jessica threw away my cookbook. The one that has been in our family for 200 years. Mom, I'm sure it was an accident, Daniel started. It wasn't, Jessica interrupted, her lawyer training making her blunt. Those old recipes were cluttering the kitchen. I was making space for what, Jessica? Margaret's voice was still pleasant, but something had changed. There was steel beneath the sweetness now. For your plans? For your renovation ideas? For the life you've been planning to live in this house once I'm gone? The room went silent. I don't know what Jessica began. Margaret opened a folder beside her plate. This is the property deed for the lakeside land in northern Vermont. 20 acres. Currently valued at $1.2 million. She slid a paper across the table. Jessica's eyes went wide. These are stock certificates worth approximately $840,000. Another paper slid across. And this, Margaret said, her voice now carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward, is my late husband's will, which specified that these assets remain in the Hayes family name, to be inherited by those who respect our family's history and values. She looked directly at Jessica. All of these documents were kept safe inside that cookbook you threw away. The cookbook you called outdated. The cookbook you treated as garbage. Jessica's face had gone white. I didn't know. No, you didn't, Margaret agreed. You didn't know because you never asked. You never cared to learn about our family history. You never showed respect for our traditions. You saw an old woman and an old book, and you assumed both were worthless. She turned to Daniel, and her expression softened with sadness. And you, my dear son, stood by and let it happen. You watched her dismantle our home, sell our family treasures, and disrespect your mother, and you said nothing. Daniel's face crumbled. Mom, I'm so sorry. I just thought, you thought it would be temporary. You thought she'd change. You thought keeping the peace was more important than keeping your word to your father and to me. Margaret stood up. Theodore and Patricia stood with her. Theodore has prepared new estate documents. The lakeside property and investments will be held in a family trust. Daniel, you will receive income from the trust, but you cannot sell the property or access the principal. This ensures your father's legacy remains intact for your children, should you have any. She looked at Jessica. As for you, Jessica, I want you out of my house by the end of the month. You can't, Jessica started, her lawyer voice emerging. I can, Margaret said firmly. This is my home. My name is on the deed. You and Daniel are guests here, and I'm asking you to leave. Jessica turned to Daniel. Are you going to let her? But Daniel was staring at his mother with tears in his eyes. For the first time in 2 years, he was really seeing her. Not as an obstacle to his wife's plans, but as the woman who had raised him, loved him, and protected his inheritance even as he failed to protect her. Jessica, he said quietly, we should go. They moved out within 2 weeks. Daniel came back alone one afternoon to talk to Margaret. Mom, I don't know what to say. Margaret was in her kitchen, the cookbook back in its rightful place on the shelf. She was making bread, her hands moving through the familiar motions of kneading. Then don't say anything yet, she told him. Just think about what kind of man you want to be. The kind your father was, or the kind who stands by while his wife disrespects the people who love him. Daniel's shoulders shook. I've been such a fool. Yes, Margaret agreed, but her voice was gentle. But fools can learn. That's what separates them from villains. Is there any way I can make this right? Margaret considered this. Time, she said finally. Time and actions. Show me that you understand what was lost. Not the money, Daniel. The respect. The love. The family bond. He nodded, wiping his eyes. And Jessica? That's between you and her. But I'll tell you this, a marriage built on ambition and calculation rather than respect and love will always crumble eventually. 3 months later, Daniel returned. This time, he came alone permanently. The divorce papers had been filed. Jessica, furious about the prenuptial agreement she'd insisted on, which now worked against her, had moved back to Boston. I need to start over, Daniel told his mother. Not here in your house. I need to find my own place, rebuild my life, figure out who I am without her influence. Margaret hugged her son. That's the smartest thing you've said in 2 years. 6 months after that Tuesday morning, Margaret received a letter. It was from Jessica's mother. Of all people. Dear Mrs. Hayes, I learned what happened between you and my daughter. Jessica gave me her version of events, but I know my daughter well enough to read between the lines. I want you to know that I'm ashamed of how she treated you. I raised her to be ambitious, but somewhere along the way, she confused ambition with cruelty, and confidence with disrespect. You taught her a lesson I failed to teach, that people are not obstacles to be managed. And that wisdom and worth are not measured by age or appearance. Thank you for that lesson. Even though I know it cost you greatly. With sincere apology and respect. Eleanor Hartwell. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her cookbook, next to a new recipe she was developing. This one was for her future grandchildren, if Daniel found the right partner someday. At the top of the page, she wrote, not everything valuable glitters. Not everything old is outdated. And never, ever underestimate a woman who knows her worth. Margaret is 80 now. She still lives in the Victorian house, though Daniel helped her make some genuine updates, not renovations. But careful improvements that respected the home's history. The cookbook sits on the kitchen shelf, exactly where it belongs. Sometimes, when Margaret bakes, she'll open it and run her fingers over the handwritten notes in the margins. Her mother's handwriting. Her grandmother's. Her great-grandmother's, and now, her own. Last month, Daniel introduced her to someone. A kind woman named Claire who teaches history at the local college. When Claire saw the cookbook, her eyes lit up. "This is incredible," she breathed, carefully turning pages. "A 200-year family archive. Do you know how rare this is?" Margaret smiled. "I do now." Daniel looked at his mother, and something passed between them. Understanding. Forgiveness. Love. "Claire," he said, "wants to help me apply for a historical preservation grant. To restore and document the cookbook properly. To preserve it for future generations." "For our future generations," Claire added shyly, and blushed. Margaret's heart soared. This was the lesson she'd wanted to teach. Not about revenge or money, but about value. Real value. The kind that can't be measured in market prices or investment returns, the kind that lives in handwritten recipes, family traditions, and the quiet strength of a woman who knows exactly what she's worth. That Tuesday morning, when Jessica threw away the cookbook, she thought she was modernizing a kitchen. What she actually did was throw away her future, and Margaret saved hers. Sometimes the most valuable things in life look ordinary. A worn cookbook. An elderly parent. A family tradition, and sometimes, the biggest mistakes are made by those who are too busy calculating what things are worth to see what they actually mean. Margaret Hayes kept her family's legacy safe for 200 years. Not with locks and safes, but with love, patience, and the quiet knowledge that respect isn't demanded, it's earned, and sometimes, it's taught. Now I want to ask you, what would you have done if you were in Margaret's shoes? When Jessica threw your cookbook in the trash, would you have confronted her immediately? Or would you have stayed silent and built your strategy, just like Margaret did? And what about Daniel? As a son, is his failure to defend his mother forgivable? Or are some mistakes made too late? Share your thoughts with me in the comments. Maybe something similar happened to you. Maybe you were also underestimated because of your age or experience. Maybe you also quietly built your strategy and eventually proved you were right. Every story has a lesson. What was the lesson of this story for you? Let's meet in the comments, and if this story made you feel something, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Because every single day, there's a new story here for you, a new lesson, a new example of quiet strength.